It's a pleasure to have you join us and share your insights about your experience as Secretary General of the Commonwealth, with members of the Round Table and representatives of civil society organizations. So what do you see as your legacy after serving as Secretary General of the Commonwealth?
Well, I would regard as my principal legacy about 5 things. First, making the Commonwealth an active agent for promoting democracy in its member countries. Secondly, establishing the capacity of the Secretary General to intervene for peace in the internal affairs of member countries. And then thirdly, the seminal role played by the Commonwealth in the transition from apartheid to democracy in South Africa. And then, of course, in the economic field, the setting up of HIPIC and so on. But if I may return to my first point, making the Commonwealth an active agent for promoting democracy in its member country.
Okay, lovely.
By the time I became Secretary General, there were no less than 10 member countries that were under either military rule or one-party state government. And at that time, the Commonwealth had been criticizing and championing the Zimbabwe course and championing sanctions against apartheid. And the Commonwealth was vulnerable to criticism by the apologists of apartheid and in the right-wing press in the UK, that there was internal contradiction within the Commonwealth, that while it was advocating democracy in Southern Africa, it tolerated members that were undemocratic. So I made that a priority of my concerns, and I went to talk in very serious conversations with the leaders of the one-party state governments. I had meetings with President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, with President Albert Rerney of Seychelles, exchanged communications with Banda of Malawi. The result of that was that they agreed to change to multi-party system of government. And in some cases, I helped, like in the case of Kenya, after my conversations with President Moi, I sent him a constitutional expert that helped to adapt the constitution of Kenya from one-party state to multi-party state. And I did this.
Thank you. Given the interventions you've mentioned, it must have been a real wrench to see your own country, Nigeria, suspended from the Commonwealth in 1995. And it was clearly a huge tribute to you that leaders decided that you should nonetheless remain Secretary General. Was it particularly awkward to negotiate with the government of Sani Abacha?
Well, it was, Nigeria was one of the countries that I was concerned about because it was under military regime. And I was a critic of that. I had conversations with President Ibrahim Babangida, who was the military leader by the time I became Secretary General. And in the end, when Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth, it was as a result of the killing, the hanging of Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 of his colleagues, despite appeals, personal appeals from me and from President Nelson Mandela. And so the heads of government at their meeting in New Zealand in 1995 took the decision that Nigeria should be suspended. And this was as a result of the initiative I had lobbied well before the meeting, not specifically directed at Nigeria because no one knew that Ken Saro-Wiwa would be hanged. But I was keen to give the Commonwealth an instrument for monitoring and sanctioning member countries that deviated from its basic democratic rules. And that led to the setting up of what came to be known as the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group of foreign ministers. The decision to set up this CMAG, as we call it, was taken, and it was in that context that Nigeria was suspended. And I suppose that because the heads of government were aware of my stand, my personal stand, and some of them suspected that I might be tempted to resign, they especially adopted in their communique a sentence reaffirming confidence in me, and that encouraged me to remain in office.
You mentioned CMAG. Seeing the way it has evolved, do you still think it is an effective instrument? Or does some people are saying that perhaps it lacks teeth?
Well, those who say that it lacked teeth have a point. But at the same time, I must say that it was effective. The reason why I say that those who say that it lacked teeth have a point was that before I left office, one of my final acts was to try and give CMAG teeth, because I believe, and still believe, that for CMAG to be effective, there has to be clearly defined rules, which if any member country broke, would automatically make it liable to sanction. At the start of CMAG, the concentration was on governments that came into power through unconstitutional means, military coup d'etat, essentially. They were automatically sanctioned. But there are other infringements of democratic rules and respect for human rights. I thought it would be easier if the Commonwealth had agreed a set of measures, a set of rules, which, if broken, would automatically invite sanctions, such as if a government sought to defer elections without agreement with the opposition parties, or if a government sought to amend constitution in order to extend its powers, its tenure. These sort of rules, and if opposition leaders were imprisoned, or if journalists were imprisoned, if it was agreed, if these rules are agreed by Commonwealth governments, then any member country that breaks these rules will be automatically sanctioned. That will give CMAG teeth. Unfortunately, when I put that idea to heads of government at my last Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Durban in 1999, it was not accepted. The idea was not accepted. And I don't think that CMAG would become effective if it relied only on sanctioning governments that came to power through unconstitutional means.
And in the context of what you've been saying, of course, there have been problems we've seen in the Malawi elections. Do you think the Commonwealth could have taken some action over that, or should have?
Well, I think that if there were established and accepted rules of the game for elections, and these rules are seen to be broken in any elections, then that country would automatically be sanctioned. You see, the Secretary General as the coordinator of the consensus decisions by the Commonwealth governments, must not be exposed to confrontation with individual members. If there was a clearly established code of conduct, and when countries break that code, then they will be sanctioned. The Secretary General would be protected in his or her position in terms of confronting a government.
So why do you think this has not happened? Why do you think the ideas that you proposed were not approved?
Well, I think because some of the leaders felt that that was going a little too far in intervening in the internal affairs of sovereign member states. Indeed, to set up the CMAG, I had to do a lot of work. I had to lobby some particular governments, heads of government. I remember my conversations with John Major in 10 Downing Street, my conversation with Mahathir, my conversations with Mandela, my conversation with Jean Chrétien of Canada. I had to convince them individually that CMAG would be the beginning of giving the Commonwealth an instrument for protecting its fundamental values. And they agreed, and I was very glad that in the CHOGM at Auckland, that was agreed. I think the situation in Nigeria helped to get them all to agree. But when it then came to defining rules, which if broken would automatically invite sanctions, some of them felt that that was going a little too far. But I was confident that over time, it's a pity that it was my last CHOGM, because I believe that in future CHOGMs and before the CHOGMs, it was possible to persuade the heads of government to agree to that.
What are your thoughts on the choice of venues for meetings of heads of government? Because, you know, sometimes these, as you know, in the case of Sri Lanka and also in the case of Rwanda, have been controversial because of their records and concerns about human rights.
Yes, I'm not surprised that the hosting of CHOGM by Sri Lanka and the prospective hosting of CHOGM by Rwanda has been controversial. The controversy arises because of the different assessments by different governments of the human rights situations in these countries. And that's exactly why I believe that if there was an independent procedure for assessing the human rights and democracy performance of member states, when those definitions are broken, there will not be controversy. Because everyone would see that there's been broken and there would be very little room for argument over it.
Are you troubled that the Commonwealth Secretariat has been the subject of negative press reports recently, especially the British media? Can anything be done about this?
Well, I think it's worrisome. It's worrisome because I've never known the Secretariat and its leader, the Secretary General, to be the subject of the sort of controversy and the sort of critical comments that have been appearing in the media. I think it's unfortunate, and I think that's anybody who cares for the Commonwealth would wish that the situation was otherwise.
Did the Commonwealth do enough during your tenure to advance the democracy and human rights agenda, not just in terms of elections and political rights, but in advancing the cause of women and those discriminated against on the grounds of their sexuality?
Yes, I think we did quite a bit. We did quite a bit in terms of advancing democratic practice by member states, in terms of promoting the cause of women. I had in the secretariat a very active director for women affairs, Wilson Smiley, and she worked very hard to advance the cause of women. And indeed, in a meeting that, a ministerial meeting that we held in Trinidad and Tobago, a decision was taken that 35% of representation in parliaments and in governance should be reserved for women. Although I don't believe that has been implemented by most Commonwealth governments, but that decision was taken at the time. It was a major and a very important decision in the service of the cause of women.
And coming back to the time when you took over as Secretary General, you succeeded Sridhar Rampal, who strode the stage in a high-profile way for 15 years. How did it feel for you taking over from him?
Well, as you know, I had worked with Sridhar Rampal for years, right from the inception of his tenure till the end of his tenure. And I greatly admired his talents for speaking and negotiations. And he was championing the sanctions against apartheid South Africa, which was a universal position at the time. And when I took over from him, of course, my taking over coincided with the change of heart by President F.W. de Klerk in South Africa, by releasing Nelson Mandela from prison. And I was therefore responsible for moving the approach of the Commonwealth from being confrontational against apartheid to helping the apartheid government to make a success of its declared intention to negotiate.
Generally, what do you think about the performance or what is achieved by Commonwealth election observer missions? Do you think that they are helping elections to be fairer, or do you think that it doesn't really matter?
I think they are helping elections to be fairer, but more importantly, they're helping in the acceptance of the results of elections. Because I remember the first real challenge was when I sent the first electoral observer group to Malaysia in 1990. I remember that the Prime Minister Mahathir, who had invited me to do so, at some point threatened to withdraw the invitation. He said so publicly. And the reason was that the advance party that I sent there, led by one of my deputies, had wanted to see a party, a group headed by a former Chief Justice that wanted to see the Commonwealth Observer Group advanced party. Prime Minister Mahathir has said no, that this was not a political party, and so on. And I threatened to withdraw the invitation. And I had conversations with him, which persuaded him to withdraw the threat and enabled me to establish the unfettered independence of the observer group to see whoever they considered a significant stakeholder in the politics of the country. And that tradition has endured, and it has helped towards the acceptance of the result. When, for example, the elections in Kenya in 1992, after the elections, Moi won the elections. The three opponents of Moi, Mwai Kibaki, Raila Odinga, and Kenneth Matiba, refused to accept the results. And there was a real threat of insurrection. I had to fly to Nairobi and had meetings with these three leaders and with Moi, and was able to convince Moi and the three leaders to accept the result on the basis of the report which the Commonwealth Observer Group, headed by a former Chief Justice of Trinidad and Tobago, had given me. And so the credibility of elections have always been helped by the presence of Commonwealth Observer Groups.
Do you think the fact that you are from Africa made governments in the region more accepting of perhaps not criticism, but any moves to take action against that than if they'd come from, say, America? Not what I say, America. If it come from Britain or Canada or Australia?
Well, it certainly helped in terms of the African countries, but I was also involved in internal peacemaking efforts in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, I had meetings, the two great ladies of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister, and Begum, who was also a Prime Minister, the wife of Begum Zia. I helped negotiated peace, sent a former Chief Justice of Australia as my representative to go and continue the negotiations. I intervened in Bangladesh. I also intervened in Papua New Guinea when there was a mutiny, military mutiny and threat of a military takeover. I had to go there to intervene with the Prime Minister, Julius Chan, and the leaders of the military in order to avoid a military takeover. And I also did intervene in Guyana over the elections when President Desmond Hoyt and Chedi Jagan were disagreeing in terms of preparations for the elections. So it was not only in Africa that I intervened, but I did intervene in these other countries.
What do you think of the Commonwealth Charter? Is enough being done, in your opinion, to give effect to its provisions?
I think the Charter is a good development, but the point is how to ensure its implementation, how to ensure its observance. I return to my theme that if you have a watchdog, an independent watchdog, observing the adherence to the principles enunciated in the Charter by member states. And when there is no adherence, when there is a contradiction of those principles, this independent watchdog would send a report to the Secretary General, which would enable the Secretary General to act or get the Commonwealth to act. I think that's what would be needed.
And China is very active in Africa, investing heavily. And is it going to be at the cost of the region's traditional links with the Commonwealth?
Not really. No, not necessarily. China's involvement in Africa has largely been productive and positive. I remember when the first major Chinese involvement in Africa was the construction of the Tanzam Railway, the railway that went from Lusaka to Dar es Salaam. I remember it involved Zambia and Tanzania. Kenneth Kaunda, president of Zambia at the time, and Julius Nyerere, president of Tanzania at the time. I remember that the World Bank and the West generally criticized that, but the two presidents were determined to have the railway, and the railway was a great, useful service, particularly at the time when Ian Smith in southern Rhodesia was bent on interrupting the flow of goods from Zambia to the coast. And that was the beginning. And of course, China has been involved in giving assistance and loans to countries, not only in Africa. I remember that the first major conference center in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, was built by the Chinese and donated to the government of, donated to Sri Lanka by the Chinese. They not only donated the buildings and so on, but they also, from the budget that was not entirely used, they set up a trust fund for the maintenance of the conference center in Colombo. I'm not up to date as to what has happened to it since then. And currently, the Chinese are involved in giving loans for infrastructural development in Africa. And that's to be welcomed. The caveat, of course, is that the African countries must make sure that that does not compromise their independence. And I believe that Commonwealth links would in no way be threatened by Chinese relationships with African countries.
How concerned are you about the difficulties of balancing development with risks to the environment? Because of course there has been concern about forests being cleared to make way for development sites, for buildings, for transport services. And is this a serious issue?
Well, the Commonwealth has been concerned about the issue of environment. I attended the Rio conference in 1992 that mapped out the future plan for protecting the environment. And the Commonwealth country of Guyana was the first country to take a major step in protection of the environment by setting up what came to be known as Iwokrama Forest Program. The government of Guyana gave a very large portion of land to maintain it in its pristine form, the forest area. The Commonwealth was involved in the management, the operation of the Iwokrama Rainforest Program. And I think the Commonwealth, I must confess, I've not been following too closely. I mean, I left Marlborough House 20 years ago. I've not been following too closely, but I believe that the tradition that began with Sonny Ramphal in the Willy Brandt report, in which Sonny Ramphal had a role to play, mapped out the compatibility between economic development and conservation, which was the beginning of what has come to be known as sustainable development. And the Commonwealth, I believe, since the end of my time, has been involved in the climate change, global discussions in the Paris Agreement, and after that. So I think that the Commonwealth, as a global grouping, I believe the strength of the Commonwealth lies in the fact that it represents not just 54 countries, but a third of humanity in terms of population. And it's located in all the continents of the world. So coordinating a consensus within the Commonwealth has a good chance of influencing global coordination in global issues.
At the 2018 summit, of course, saw the unprecedented involvement of the British royal family and royal institutions, such as Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Do you welcome this? And can we expect greater delegation by the head of the Commonwealth to members of to the Queen's family in the coming years?
Well, I think without any doubt, one of the most powerful cementing factors in the Commonwealth has been the role of the Queen as the symbolic head of the Commonwealth. I think the Commonwealth has been fortunate to have the Queen, a real promoter of the Commonwealth. And in that position, she has contributed to saving the Commonwealth from major crises. I remember that at the Commonwealth CHOGM, the Conference of Heads of Government in 1979 in Lusaka, the Commonwealth was faced with the possibility of a breakup because the issue of Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, was a very controversial issue in the Commonwealth. There was British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher advocating views that seemed to be sympathetic to the Ian Smith regime, and the others vehemently opposed to that regime. It was Her Majesty's reception at which I remember that she stayed so long and talked with foreign ministers and heads of government that created the environment for reaching a consensus on how to deal with the issue of Rhodesia. And that led to the Lancaster House Conference that solved the problem and produced basis for Zimbabwe's independence. And so I think that the link with the British monarch has been a very positive link. And until the Commonwealth evolves completely into an unquestioned international organization, that link will remain important, and that's why I support it very much.
And the final question: if you are still in charge of the Commonwealth and its secretariat, given the adoption of the Charter of the Commonwealth, what would you do to promote awareness of the Charter throughout the organization, and in particular amongst young citizens?
Well, it's not easy for me to give the Commonwealth Secretary General prescription of what to do. But if I were to answer your hypothetical question, I would say this time the major global challenge we face is the pandemic. I would work hard to see that the Commonwealth plays a role in the distribution of the vaccine that everyone expects will be the cure to the COVID-19. The Commonwealth should use its network to ensure that the vaccine reaches both the rich and the poor populations of the Commonwealth. And secondly, the Commonwealth should take seriously the challenge of playing a role in the revival of the economies of its member states, including in particular the small states, because this pandemic has done and is doing great damage to the economies of countries all over the world. And I would hope that the Commonwealth has a role to play in the revival of the economies. And then for the youth of the Commonwealth, because the future of the Commonwealth, I believe, is in the hands of the young members of the Commonwealth, who constitute by far the majority population of the Commonwealth. I would think of projects that should excite the young people and give them hope in the future.